Well, when Tim offered to let me do the adult Bible class, he commented that I could do kind of whatever I wanted, which was an easy choice for me. Apologetics is my area of special interest. This is the first time I've been able to do this specific lesson, just the way it's laid out. So you're my guinea pigs, so hope that's okay. And I hope you can see the screen at all. It's the first time I've shown that PowerPoint, so afterwards I may be tweaking it to make sure it's visible. I'll be giving this same lesson tomorrow night at the campus of OSU IT in Okmulgee. The Glenpool congregation sponsors a campus ministry down there, and we've reserved a room, and we're going to get to be able to go down and do an open lecture on Does God Exist? And then I get to do the same lecture, I think 24th or something like that, in Oklahoma City. So I'm glad that you get to be my guinea pig as I work through this. The question of does God exist is one, of course, of considerable importance, and it's one that is being asked more. So I want to give you a really candid statement, and I hope it's not offensive. Some of you are from a generation, by the tint of your hair, okay, where the question, does God exist, was not at the forefront of the debate. You lived in a society where most people probably took for granted that God existed and probably took for granted that the Bible in some way communicated His Word. And so the religious debates we've had for the last 200 years have been about how do we read the Bible? And that's what we've been arguing about. The battle line has moved, and we've got to be aware of that, or we're going to be left standing out there by ourselves talking to no one. And that's where a lot of the church has ended up in a position of irrelevance, because they're having a 100-year-old argument that no one's asking about. The question today is should we take the Bible as a revelation of God? And then even beyond that, who's this God? And should we bother? And can we know Him? Is it even reasonable to know Him? Today we live in a world of militant atheists. Names that come to mind, the four horsemen of new atheism, Richard Dawkins, Daniel Dennett, Hitchens, and Sam Harris. Are the four authors that are all best-selling authors, all writing. Hitchens just passed away a little bit ago, but they're all writing best-selling works on the God delusion, the moral landscape, how atheism is the future, and the rest of you are delusional. You're crazy people. There's something wrong with your brains. Dawkins proposed legislation at one point in the UK, where he's from, suggesting that teaching your children the creation account in Genesis might be a form of child abuse. Okay? So again, this it's not just a sit back and be interested in the question atheism. This is a militant, angry atheism. Angry is the right word. There's a lot of rage attached to it. So it's forced us to come back to these very old questions. Does God exist, and is it reasonable to believe in God? To be able to answer this question, we've got to realize a couple of things. First of all, Aristotle said, long time ago, all instruction given or received by way of argument proceeds from pre-existent knowledge. And what he means by that is, if you want to know something, you have to know something. That is to say, before I can convince you of something, I have to know what you're willing to accept as evidence of what we're discussing. In the philosophical world, this is called epistemology. How do I know truth? How do you come to know things? And that's the situation we're in, where the game has changed. Maybe when you were growing up, the discussion was, well, we believe the Bible, so what's next? Well, now that's not taken for granted. And so because of that, I have to go back now and say, okay, well, what do we know? What can we all agree on, and where can we start? And in our pluralistic society, there is no answer to that question. There is no universal starting place for this discussion. It is either the blessing or the curse of postmodernism, depending on your philosophical bent. We live in a world where there is no single point, where everybody's there and we can start there. And so what I'm going to do this morning is to give you what I'm calling 12 approaches to God. Why 12? Because I didn't have 13. No, why 12? Because I have no idea what you're willing to accept as a starting point. And so some of these, you're going to hear them and say, oh, yeah, I agree with that basic point, and so here's the argument. Some of them you'll hear and say, oh, I don't agree with that at all. And so will your friends. So these are 12 different approaches, and the idea is that wherever the launching point is, for you personally or for people that you know, there's a way to get from there to God. You know the old sign, can't get there from here. There is always a way to get to God from where you are. We just got to figure out where that is. And so we've got 12 approaches this morning. Now, 12 approaches in something like 45 minutes for a guy who can barely tell time anyway is a little bit nerve-wracking. So, as you might guess, we're not going to go into great detail on any one of these. That's not my goal. My goal is to whet your appetite a little bit, in that you'd hear something that you'd say, now that's one that I feel like would help me and might be helpful to someone else, and you can go research that particular way of thinking on your own. This is just a teaser of what's out there, because a lot of times we don't think about it. I grew up believing in God, so I didn't have to have one of these approaches to God. That's actually one of the first approaches. So I want to give you some options, some avenues of approach to God, and I hope you'll be benefited by it. The first one, and I have them conveniently numbered if my slides work. We'll see how it goes. Hey, there it goes. Number one is the possibility that we don't have to prove anything. This is a point, I'm going to give you a quote here from W.K. Clifford, who wrote, this is not a new author. W.K. Clifford wrote 2 centuries ago, okay? So this is not a new debate, it turns out, in case someone suggested that it was. Clifford said, "It is wrong always, everywhere, and for anyone to believe anything upon insufficient evidence." And this is kind of the claim that is at the root of new atheism. You've got to have evidence for your belief, or you have no right to believe it. And they criticize people of faith because they say you're just up front abandoning any kind of realistic evidence, and it seems like you're happy about it. And they're very angry with us because of that rejection of Clifford's point. It's wrong always, everywhere, in every case, for anyone to believe anything on insufficient evidence. The problem with that particular statement is, in philosophy, it's what's called an incoherent statement, which basically means if it's true, it's false. Yeah, that'll run your day, right? If it's true, it's false. And what do I mean by that? If it's wrong everywhere in every case for anyone to believe anything on insufficient evidence, what is the sufficient evidence for believing that it's wrong everywhere in any case for anyone to believe anything upon any sufficient evidence? Right? I mean, he just pulled that out of the air and said, whoop, there it is, it's wrong. Says who? Says W.K. Clifford. See, there's no evidence. It's not written in stone anywhere. In fact, in the more modern author, Alva Plantinga, who spent most of his career at Notre Dame of late, probably the best philosopher, especially the best Christian philosopher in the last century, Plantinga challenged this whole notion and said, you know, as human beings, we know things all the time that we don't have a specific kind of evidence for. Do you know who your parents are? You know, from a child, you knew who your parents were. Now, you could do a test. They have tests for that. I'm betting most of you haven't done it. Well, it's immoral for you to believe that your parents are your parents because you don't have sufficient scientific evidence. Can you imagine living your life like that? Plantinga's favorite example, this one's kind of fun, is believing in other people's minds. How do I know you have a mind? By definition, I can't know that you have a mind, right? I can't experience your consciousness. I only have mine. And so by definition, I cannot ever prove scientifically, philosophically, psychologically that you have a mind. And yet, can you imagine going through life thinking everybody else was just kind of some kind of figment of your imagination? I'm sure there's someone out there doing it. But most of us, we say, yeah, you know, I don't have any evidence for it. I feel pretty confident that you have an actual mind. And I don't even mean brain. We could cut your head open and find your brain. I mean mind. That when you say I'm happy, you mean the same thing I mean. When you say I am in pain, that you mean the same thing I mean. How could you prove that? You can't. Not in the conscious level. So what Plantinga says is, how would you ever live your life if you live by this standard? How many of you have been to Hawaii? Show of hands. Who has been to Hawaii? Prove it. Okay? Well, you say, well, I got there and the pilot said, welcome to Hawaii. Who cares? Welcome to Hawaii. Well, no, I got there and there was a sign and it said, welcome to Hawaii. I can give you a sign. We can put it right here in Broken Arrow. Sell tickets. Right? How many of you did a geological survey around the island to make sure you were actually there and the guy didn't just fly you around somewhere and drop you off at Lake Eufaula? Right? Nobody does that. You live every day in a state of trust in a lot of information that you don't ask for scientific information. So what Plantinga is trying to tell us is it could be that belief in God is what he calls a properly basic belief. That it's just so fundamentally obvious, maybe we don't have to prove it. Maybe it's like you have a mind and the universe is older than 5 minutes old and I had toast this morning. Maybe it's just one of those things that you can just say you believe in. You say, Ben, I'm not convinced by that. That's okay, I've got another slide. Number two, it's possible that we could make an argument, what's called the cosmological argument. Cosmology, cosmos, from the Greek term cosmos, means the orderly arrangement of things, and it's a term we use for the universe itself. And the cosmological argument is a very old argument. You can find it in ancient Christian writers. You can find it in ancient Jewish authors. You can find it in ancient Islamic authors. It's a very old argument, not new at all. It's been revitalized of late. If you ever get a book by William Lane Craig, he's probably the most vocal proponent of this view today. Then he says, here's a simple argument. Number one, whatever has a beginning of existence must have a cause. The universe began to exist. The universe must have been caused to exist. And what he's arguing there is based on the brute fact that the universe exists and it hasn't always existed. We know there must be something that has caused it to exist. Let's look at the two premises to see that the argument is validly constructed. So if the first two things are true, the third one follows. Okay? But are the first two things true? Number one, is it true that whatever has a beginning of existence must have a cause? And there are, I kid you not, legitimate scientific minds out there challenging that idea, saying, well, I don't like this conclusion, so maybe it is the case that the universe can kind of pop into existence. Like the rabbit coming out of the hat, only without the hat, right? But what I want to suggest to you is in your everyday experience, in common human experience, you're aware of the fact that things normally don't just kind of wink into existence. And so it defies the human experience. It also defies various laws of physics, if you care, but it defies the human experience to say that things just kind of pop into existence. For things to happen, and we can go back as far as Aristotle again, and Aristotle will say somebody has to will things to happen. You will it to be. Okay? You cause, you move. And Aristotle, all the way back there, talked about there must be some kind of unmoved mover who starts the ball rolling. What about the second one? Maybe the universe has always been here. That was Aristotle's answer, by the way. It's a very old view. Maybe the universe has just always been here. Oddly enough, modern science, that we don't always think is our friend, is doing us a big favor today. Modern science believes the universe has a beginning. Now, there's a great big argument with people of faith and how that beginning came about and what to do with Genesis chapter 1 and counting years and things like that. Here's the best part. We're not arguing about that today. I can take that whole discussion, put it in a box, set it aside. Modern scientists and modern believers in the Bible both agree the universe had a beginning. And that's a relatively new fact. Up until the 1900s, people still believed, by and large, the universe may have always been here. But it's the laws of thermodynamics, the laws of modern physics and astronomy that have brought us inexorably to the conclusion that no, there was a beginning. We can push it back as far as you want. It's now back to 13.8 billion years. It was 13.7 when I was a kid. It'll be 13.9 later. But however far back it is, modern science is in agreement that there was a start. Okay, great. That's number two. So now number one is true from our normal experience. Number two is true because science tells me so. I kid you not. I've got a graduate level cosmology book in my office because I'm that kind of nerd. And in the very end of this book, where it's outlining the history of the universe, the development of everything through Big Bang cosmology, the very end, the final chapter, atheistic author named Dr. Shu says, oddly enough, this is an agreement with the ancient biblical text, quotes Genesis 1 through 3 in the textbook, and then moves on like he hadn't done it. Okay? That strangely, for no other reason than that, science is in agreement with that one fact, nothing else but that. Okay? So that's kind of amazing when you think about it. But you're not sure about that one? That's all right. I've got another slide. What about the teleological argument? The teleological argument comes from the Greek term teleos, or telos, which means an end of things, a purpose. So the cosmological asks, where did it come from? Teleological says, where is it going? Do things that we see have a purpose? And so we ask a person, do you believe that the universe has a purpose? Barring that, do you believe that your life has a purpose? Do you believe that elements in the created universe have a function or a purpose? And if they do, then that seems to mean something. If reality exhibits evidence of purpose and intent, and that purposeful feature is very unlikely to have arisen through random or unguided processes, then it is reasonable to conclude that this intent is the result of a purposeful choice to embed the intent in reality. The famous argument for this comes from William Paley a century ago, who said, imagine finding a watch on a beach, and you're walking along, and there's the rocks, and there's the seashells, and there's this pocket watch, right? And you open it up, and it's ticking along, and it has a function. It has independent parts, all moving in concert together, very precise in its motions, very precise in its size. All the gears have to be exactly right to make it do its thing. And it has a purpose. It's not a random purpose. It has a purpose. It tells time. What would you conclude about the watch? Well, you wouldn't conclude that it was just kind of a random assembly of parts. You would say somebody assembled this with an intent, with a telos, right? With a purpose. Someone put this together for a reason. And what Paley is suggesting, and what modern biologists and others have said of the same thing, that when we look at the level of complexity in our universe, from the great big giant stuff down to the microscopic cellular level, we see that evidence of intent, that things do things. That's a real profound statement. Things do things. Stuff does stuff. That's really what we see, and it's hard to break it down any lower than that. We talk about DNA as being inscribed with language, because it is, right? The Human Genome Project kind of brought to life how much data is stored in just this tiny bit of DNA that all of us carry around and don't even worry about. It's like DNA is like a blueprint that builds the house, and in the house is a room that makes more blueprints that make more houses. DNA has that level of complexity and function built into every strand, and it's incredible that it's there. Another version of this same argument is to talk more modern, the work of Michael Behe and what he calls intelligent design or irreducible complexity. Again, some people find this interesting, some don't. Behe says, an irreducibly complex system cannot be produced directly, that is, by continuously improving the initial function, which continues to work by the same mechanism, by slight successive modifications of a precursor system, because any precursor to an irreducibly complex system that is missing a part is by definition non-functional. Well, that was irreducibly complex itself. That's a really dense sentence. What he's trying to say is this: there are things we find in nature that not only have purpose, but they have codependent purposes. So, for example, in single-cell organisms, you'll sometimes find them that have what's called a flagellar motor. And the flagellar motor is a small filament that sticks out the back, and it attaches through the lining of the cell, through the membrane. And around this is a series of rotors. If you look at it, it looks like an outboard motor. There's a series of rotors and bearings that turn on the molecular level to make this thing spin at hundreds of thousands of rotations per second. And it can stop on a dime, change direction, and reverse. You wish your boat could do that. Okay? It's incredibly complex. But what's even more fascinating than that it works is that it couldn't work if you took out any of the parts. If you take out the bearings, then you just have this filament sticking out that doesn't turn. A filament that doesn't spin is called an anchor. It's not helping you go, it's making you less fit for existence. Take out the U-joint, and it can only go forward. See how well that works for you. You see the problem here? Take out all of it, and you just got a hole in the membrane that destroys the cell. That all along, somehow you have to have all of these pieces developing at the same time, or close to it, or else they're actually counterproductive. And somehow, in the cell, you have all of these pieces working together cohesively in a way that's what Behe calls irreducibly complex. It's not just complex, it's complex, and you couldn't make it any simpler and still have it work. That's one option that seems to speak to an existence of a God or creator who intended it to be. Another argument along this line is the fine-tuning of the universe. Let me tell you kind of what we mean by fine-tuning. If you find a pile of lumber, or let me try this again. After an ice storm, you find a pile of limbs, okay? Now, all the limbs are of different dimensions, different thickness, different sizes, different shape. You figure, okay, they just kind of fell out of a tree. Now, what if you see a pile of limbs, but they're all cut exactly the same shape, and there's 50 of them? Well, now you start to think, well, that didn't fall out of a tree, right? It's too precise, it's too finely tuned to be the result of things just falling out of trees. What if you see 50,000 2x4s all cut to exactly the same length. The man who says that fell out of a tree needs some help, right? That's the basic idea behind fine-tuning. In the universe, we see a universe that is finely tuned to a level that is actually hard to express. This argument is one of my favorite because of my physics background, but it's the hardest for me to explain because it requires a sense of the bigness of the universe that I simply cannot convey no matter how much I speak or wave my hands in the air. There's just nothing I can do, but I'm going to try. I'm going to give you one example of hundreds I could give you. I want to talk about the gravitational constant. The gravitational constant is what makes gravity work, as you might guess. It is a fixed number. It's the same number on Earth, it's the same number on Mars, it's the same number on Alpha Centauri, it's the same number any galaxy anywhere in the universe as far as we can tell. It's a fixed constant of the entire universe. Everything else can change. G has to be the same. 6.673 times 10 to the negative 11th meters cubed over kilogram second squared. I know you're all going to write that down for the test later. Hope you have that tucked away. What's fascinating about that number is not only is it fixed, if you change it, it's not just life that can't exist. Matter cannot exist. Chemistry cannot exist. The universe, as we know it, cannot exist if you change that number even a tiny amount, and there's no word for tiny that helps me out here, so let me try to demonstrate it, quoting a little bit from William Lane Craig, who says, if this constant varied by just 1 in 10 to the 60th parts, none of us would exist. What does 10 to the 60th mean? All right, I'm going to try with a metaphor. I want you to imagine a dial. This dial is G. It's the big gravitational constant, okay? It's got 10 numbers on it, 1 through 10, okay? That's 1 in 10 to the first. Now take one of those, the first digit, 1, okay? Subdivide that into 10 more slots, 10 more marks. Now you've got 100 marks on your dial. That's 10 to the second. Take one of those, subdivide it 10 more times. Now you've got 1,000 marks on your dial. That's 10 to the third. Keep subdividing that dial until you get 10 to the 60th dashes on your dial. 10 to the 60th subdivisions. You've done that process of subdividing by 10 60 times over. Move it that much, and the universe stops existing. Antony Flew was one of the most famous atheists of the 20th century. I have a book on my shelf called Atheistic Humanism, written by Antony Flew. Debated a preacher from the Churches of Christ, actually, named Thomas Warren, decades ago. One of the most outspoken atheists of our time, converted at the end of his life to a kind of theism. And if you asked him why, what finally convinced you after all the arguments you had patented to tell us that there is no God, he said it is the fine-tuning of the universe. We just shouldn't be here. There is no reason to think we should be here, and here we are. The universe is so specifically set. But I've got to move on. Number 6. Likewise, we could talk about the regularity of the universe and the success of physics and mathematics. It's strange that science works. Science works so well we take it for granted, but it doesn't have to. Why is it that, I mentioned big G a moment ago, why is it the force due to gravity is big G times m over r squared? Why is it that way? Why is it that I can write down in just a few letters an equation that describes gravity and makes sense? And it works that way every time. Drop that apple 1,000 times, drop that apple 100,000 times, you get the same 9.81 meters per second squared on the way down. Everything the same way, every time. Why is it that way? The fathers of modern science, Einstein developing modern relativity, Heisenberg developing a lot of what went into modern quantum mechanics, had a conversation, and Heisenberg said this to Einstein: if nature leads us to mathematical forms of great simplicity and beauty, and by forms I am referring to coherent systems of hypotheses, axioms, etc., to forms that no one has previously encountered, we cannot help thinking that they are true, that they reveal a genuine feature of nature. You must have felt this too, the almost frightening simplicity and wholeness of the relationships which nature suddenly spreads out before us and for which none of us was in the least prepared. He says the more we studied, the more the universe made sense. the more the math worked. Why does the universe make sense? Why isn't it, to use a kind of mundane example, why can't I drop the apple and it just goes up one time? Why does the math always work? And why is it, to quote Einstein, that I only know it's true if it's beautiful? Why is it so precise? There's no reason it should have to be that way. We could wake up in a new set of physics every morning. But for some reason, there is this regularity and consistency to the laws of physics that to the greatest minds who studied it, as he said, was frightening. That they had peeked behind a curtain and they were not prepared for what they saw. A frightening intellect behind the mechanics of the universe. Another argument that might be interesting to you is an ancient argument from Anselm in the 11th century. It is the ultimate acquired taste. You know, there are some things that you kind of have to learn to like. The ontological argument is that argument. Everyone I've ever told it to the first time says, "What?" And then like the 10th time, sometimes they go, "Oh, yeah, that's all right." And that's kind of the way it was for me. It took me a while to like it. So I'm going to give it to you. It's one of my 12. You can like it or not like it. It's okay. Anselm said it in the form of a prayer. Even the fool is convinced that something exists in the understanding, at least, than which nothing greater can be conceived. For when he hears of this, he understands it, and whatever is understood exists in the understanding. And assuredly that than which nothing greater can be conceived cannot exist in the understanding alone. Here's the argument. The argument is, can you imagine a greatest possible being? Can you imagine a being so great, greater than which nothing could be thought? To use Anselm's really awkward phrase. Greater than which nothing could be thought. Can you imagine that being? Okay. Now, does that being exist? Well, if it doesn't exist, I can imagine a greater being. Right? Because it would be greater to exist than not exist. So I can imagine a greater being. Therefore, that being that I can imagine exists. People who like the argument think it's a definitive mathematical and philosophical proof of the existence of God. Everyone else says, huh? Yeah, it's an acquired taste. That none other than Alvin Plantinga in recent years has kind of brought it back by saying, could God exist? Is it possible? Is he a necessary being? Could there be a being that's so profoundly necessary to the universe he could not exist? And has developed that. It's interesting. If it's interesting to you, go study it. I've got more slides. Number 8, the human intellect argument. This is the argument that says, how are we able to have this conversation? Ponder this for a moment. In the atheistic scheme of things, we are stardust, animated and composed of rather random processes, maybe not entirely random, but mostly random. And yet here we are in Broken Arrow, Oklahoma, having a conversation about the deep philosophical meaning of the universe, why you're here, and who else is here with us. How can we even have this question? What is it that means that humans can ask deep questions? Paul Davies is a professor of mathematical physics, and he says, we human beings are able to grasp at least some of nature's secrets. We have cracked part of the cosmic code. Why this should be, just why Homo sapiens should carry the spark of rationality that provides the key to the universe, is deep enigma. We who are children of the universe, animated stardust, can nevertheless reflect on the nature of that same universe, even to the extent of glimpsing the rules on which it runs. How we have become linked into this cosmic dimension is a mystery, yet the linkage cannot be denied. We can do philosophy, we can do physics, we can do astronomy, we can write poetry, we can paint beautiful paintings. And there's no reason for us to have that capacity. There's no evolutionary advantage to appreciating beauty, for example. Just one quick example. Imagine a snowy landscape, the perfect, pristine, snowy landscape. Okay? And you stare at it, and you're awed by its beauty. There's 2 cavemen. One of them stops and says, wow, that's beautiful. He freezes to death. The other one says, I'm not impressed. He goes into his cave. Is there an evolutionary advantage to being impressed by a snowy field? No, there's no reason to stop and stare at a vista. He stops and stares at the beautiful mountain vista, and a mountain lion eats him. The other guy passes on. There's no evolutionary advantage for whimsy, for philosophy, for deep questions about existence. We should only have the capacity to hunt better and reproduce better and find better shelter. And yet we can do things that just don't make sense on an evolutionary level. We're the universe thinking about itself. And there's no reason that should be the case unless there is a God. Number 9, there's the moral argument. This is my absolute favorite. Fine-tuning is a close second. Absolute favorite. Here's how it works. You get one word. That's all you need. To the person you're talking to, or if it's you personally considering this, think of something that you believe is actually, fundamentally, unequivocally, absolutely wrong. I don't care what it is. You don't have to tell me. I gave an example on the screen. Rape is wrong. Most people say, yep, I agree. Why? I got to listen to a brief discussion. Ravi Zacharias, a Christian apologist, was here, not here, but on the stage. William Lane Craig was on the other side, and there was an atheist moral philosopher in between them, which was a terrible place for him to be. And he was complaining about how awful and brutal and barbaric the Bible was. You know, the Bible has slavery in it. Oh, boy. And he says, how can you believe a Bible that has that stuff in it? And William Lane Craig says, are you saying that it would be bad to have slaves? Well, yes, of course it would be bad to own slaves. And William Lane Craig said, why? And the man babbled for 5 minutes. PhD in moral ethics, nothing coherent to say. Because in a world without God, there's no moral grounding to our ethical perception. I can say it's wrong for me, I can't say it's wrong for you. Why is rape wrong? One mammal biped has intercourse with another mammal biped on a little planet in a little solar system in a little galaxy in a little universe that does not matter. Why does anyone care? If there's a God, it might matter a great deal. But otherwise, why would we bother? What is this right and wrong that we all think exists? Stranger still, why don't we think we're doing the right? If it's just made up, please understand, if it's just made up, I'm going to make up stuff that makes me right. Bow ties are now required by law. Right? If I'm going to, telling lies and being selfish are now good, right? If I get to make up morality, I wouldn't pick out stuff that makes me feel bad. And yet every person in the world says the world is not quite right. I've done things I'm not proud of. Even atheists would say, I've done things I'm not proud of. Why do we have a moral sense that continues to convict us? If it's just invented, why didn't we invent something a little easier to do? And yet there's this moral reality of the world that we can't explain. C.S. Lewis said it like this: my argument against God was that the universe seemed to be so cruel and unjust. But how had I got this idea of just and unjust? If the whole show was bad and senseless from A to Z, so to speak, why did I, who was supposed to be part of the show, find myself in such violent reaction against it? He was concerned about why there's so much cruelty in the universe if God made it. And then he realized if God didn't make it, it doesn't matter that it's cruel. I think the moral argument is very powerful and needs to be re-examined today. Another argument that might be helpful to you is the resurrection argument. I think this is helpful to it, especially from the Christian point of view. This is something we have that other religious groups do not have. Christianity has a resurrection argument. Could there be an event such that if it could be known to have happened, the existence of God would be necessarily concluded from knowledge of that event? Could something happen? This is like asking, could you be convinced? I mean, if you say no, nothing could ever happen, God could not do anything to convince me that He exists, then you've kind of tipped your hand, haven't you? Right? You're no longer an honest, open-minded person examining evidence. You've now decided that God could not possibly exist, and He couldn't convince you He exists if He wanted to. And that's a bias. We've all got them. Let's be honest about them, okay? Could there be an event? What kind of event would it take to convince you beyond a shadow of a doubt? I think Christianity claims there was such an event, and it's the resurrection of Jesus Christ. If there's one fact that science has always agreed on, it's that everyone dies and the dead stay dead. Every cemetery and every graveyard in all the world and all of human history bears testimony to that fact. And early Christians in the first century weren't unaware of it. We act like they were just idiots who didn't know dead people stayed dead, and they were cleverly confused, right? No, they knew the dead stayed dead. Everybody dies, the dead stayed dead. They saw Jesus of Nazareth die, and then they saw Him again. And they went to the tomb, and there was nobody in it. And both of those things are important. N.T. Wright has probably the most definitive modern work on the resurrection of Jesus Christ. And he makes the case, if there was just an empty tomb, you could say, well, maybe somebody took the body. If they just saw Him, you could say, well, maybe they thought they saw Him. But when you combine an empty tomb and events where they see their Lord, a person they know, right? It's not as if I didn't know what he looked like. I thought he saw him. Person they had known and communed with and been with all this time. They see him. They eat fish with him by the Sea of Tiberias in John chapter 21. And they experience his bodily resurrection. Is there anything God could do that would be an act so clear in history that if it happened, he must exist? I think the resurrection is just that act, and that's just why the early Christians were so emphatic about the importance of the resurrection. Ancient Judaism believed in the resurrection, kind of. I mean, it was on the side. If you look in the Old Testament, it's there, but it's not important. You don't read chapter after chapter about the resurrection. It's just kind of mentioned in passing, and they move on. That's not what you see in the New Testament. In the New Testament, the resurrection goes from out here on the periphery to front and center. It is the trademark of the New Testament. The Greeks didn't even believe in it. They would have been a much more popular movement if they would have just ditched the resurrection. You remember Acts chapter 17? Paul goes up to Athens. He preaches, and everyone's saying, and then he says, and Jesus is risen from the dead, and they say, huh? And they're not sure anymore. If they would just ditch the resurrection, they could move on. They couldn't. Why? Because it happened. And why would people believe in that? In Acts chapter 2, Peter preaches a sermon and says, Jesus is risen from the dead, and they're within walking distance of the tomb. And 3,000 people want to be baptized in imitation of his resurrection. It's a fact that changed people's lives because it was a fact that happened. I think we have to reckon with it. Number 11, as we kind of start wrapping this down, number 11 is the possibility of internal experience. This one is not as strong for me, but I feel compelled to mention it because I think it can be useful. John Calvin wrote of the sensus divinitatis, or the sense of divinity that resides in every human. He claimed that even false religion was an evidence for God, that everybody feels like there's something out there. Isaac Newton, great scientist, said, atheism is a philosophy that has always been too odious for too many to believe. Atheism, until very recently, has always been a minority. Why do people just feel compelled to believe in God? It's a strange fact. I mentioned William Lane Craig a moment ago. He's got 2 PhDs in philosophy and theology, one of the brightest people living on the planet. If you ask him, what argument convinces you of the existence of God, he will look back at you and say, oh, none of them. It's the internal testimony of the Holy Spirit. And we say, thanks, Will. We were looking for someone really clever, and that's what he gives us. That he says, for me, there is a personal experience that he has with God that is so real he just can't deny it. And all the philosophical stuff is great, but he says, he's there. I know he's there. He's in here. Alvin Plantinga, I've mentioned several times today. If you ask him, he can go through and refute every one of these arguments halfway. He has a halfway response, kind of a tongue-in-cheek. I could ignore that one if I wanted to, and I could ignore that one if I wanted to. Okay, well, Plantinga, why do you believe in God? Wasn't it obvious? That's his answer. Again, one of the foremost philosophers of our day who says, isn't it obvious? When I look at the world, it seems pretty clear that he's there. And so it could be that a Christian in the course of their life does experience God in a way that is not accessible to science or maybe even to philosophy, but that personal experience is real. If humans have a sense of the divine or an inexplicable desire for religion, then this feature of human history is easily explained by classical theism, right? We've all got a God-shaped hole in our heart we're trying to fill. On the other hand, in the absence of God, this feature remains something of a mystery. I think we have to ponder that. Why do we keep going back to God or gods? Why do we keep running back to that to make sense of our lives? There's a God-shaped hole in every one of us that we're trying to fill, and I think that matters. Finally, the last one on my slideshow. There's lots of other things we could talk about. But a last approach to God, number 12, is what's called shared experience. And this is a little different. I want you to think about it. It's a good place to end for a church group. Karl Barth was probably the greatest theologian of the 20th century, and he wrote, theology had first to renounce all apologetics or external guarantees of its position within the environment of other sciences, for it will always stand on the firmest ground when it simply acts according to the law of its own being. That's a dense statement. What he seems to be saying is this: at the end of the day, the most compelling argument for God is not the other 11 slides. It's not a philosophical argument. It's not a scientific argument. the most compelling argument for God is the church being the church. When the church is living out its purpose in fullness and beauty, it transforms the world. When Christians are digging abandoned babies out of dumpsters, it transforms the world. When Christians are dying for their faith with nothing to gain for it, it changes the world. The greatest evidence is the shared experience we have of faith and communion and baptism and the life of faith and imitation of Jesus Christ. The life of Jesus Christ is the model of that. There's a lot of reasons to come to God and to know that He exists. The question I want to conclude with, and this is yours, am I as skeptical of every other facet of my life as I am of God? Am I demanding of Him something I ask of nothing else? Be fair with yourself and consider these things. If you have any questions about them, I'd love to talk about them with you later, but I'm out of time. So appreciate you listening to me today.